Hi, this is Deena Thomson, author of Fallen Poppies, and this is Chapter 15.
Chapter 15. The flickering light bulbs shone on Tamara's limp figure, suspended from the ceiling beams. Her light frame swayed gently in the dim light as she hung suspended from chicken wire wrapped tightly around her throat, her toes barely grazing the floor below. Dead eyes stared blankly ahead from her pale gray face. Shauna burst into the room after hearing JoBeth scream and collided with Tamara's lifeless body, twirling slightly with the force. The sharp edges of the chicken wire had sliced through Tamara's skin, causing blood to drip from her neck. It trickled down and landed on Shauna's face. Tamara's eyes were open and bulging, her expression a mask of terror. Unable to look away, Shauna's knees began to buckle. Alan rushed forward and scooped up her small, limp body as if she were a rag doll, carrying her away from the gruesome scene. JoBeth stood motionless, shock written across her face. Behind Tamara's frame, the baby was crying. Snapping out of her shock, JoBeth squeezed past the corpse's hanging legs, trying in vain not to touch the bloody body. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," JoBeth cooed, lifting the sobbing infant to her. The baby buried her head in JoBeth's shoulder, calmed by her familiar voice. "JoBeth?" "I'm in here, Alan," JoBeth called back, rocking baby Joy. She couldn't turn to his voice. To do so would mean facing those dreadful, swaying legs. "Are you all right?" he asked, appearing beside Tamara's hanging body. JoBeth shook her head, refusing to look his way. She kissed the top of the baby's soft black hair and fought back the urge to cry. The room fell silent as she searched for the right words. Her eyes scanned his face for anything to make sense of what all this meant. He stared at her with an unreadable expression, his jaw tense. "Now what?" Her throat felt dry and tight as she spoke his name. She shifted her weight nervously, her eyes darting around the room. "Now what?" "Pass me the baby." Alan reached out his hands. JoBeth placed Joy in his arms. Instinctively, the baby grasped at the hem of Tamara's nightgown, causing her body to teeter on the wire. "No, Joy!" JoBeth yanked the baby's hand roughly away. "Get out of there, JoBeth," Alan pleaded, reaching out his hand. She took it, pinching herself through the doorway, careful not to touch Tamara. When she was safely through, Alan handed the baby back. "Go to Shauna. She needs you. This is going to mess her up for a long time." Alan raked his hand through his hair, clenching his teeth. Damn her. Damn her for doing this to Shauna. To us." JoBeth stood beside him, her petite frame trembling. She looked up at him expectantly, her voice barely a whisper. "Alan?" He shifted, gathering them both close in his strong arms. "Don't worry, JoBeth. I'll take care of it. I'll take care of everything." He held her and the baby tight, pressing his lips to her forehead, reassuring her with a soft kiss. JoBeth squeezed her eyes shut, trying desperately to hold herself together. "Go to Shauna. Go." He gently turned her in the direction of the other room down the hall. JoBeth, clutching the baby, walked in a daze to Shauna. Alan began the gruesome chore of taking Tamara's body down from the beams. With trembling hands, he stood on a step stool, untangling Tamara from the rafters and slowly lowering her limp form. Her glassy eyes stared blankly from her pasty, lifeless face. Carefully laying her on the floor, he gingerly wrapped her in a clean sheet, like a precious package, taking a moment to take stock of the tragedy. Arrangements would have to be made to bury her. He would explain that her death was caused by complications during childbirth and a broken heart, caused by losing her husband before she gave birth. No one needed to know that Tamara had killed herself. As he started to clean up the blood that had dripped onto the floor, he noticed a piece of paper on the night table. He picked it up. Reading it, his shoulders shook, overcome with emotion, as he read Tamara's last words JoBeth and Shauna had just begun to teach her how to write. Tamara was buried in the town cemetery, inside the church graveyard. Alan and JoBeth's lie about Tamara's death would keep her out of the shunned cemetery. They could not stand the thought of her spending eternity disdained. They knew they were giving her more than a final resting place, but a sense of peace that she was denied in life. JoBeth stood at the edge of the gaping hole in the ground, surrounded by silent friends. Tamara's daughter buried her face in JoBeth's shoulder. She closed her eyes and clutched Shauna's trembling hands, her cold fingers laced with hers. Alan's strong arms swept around Shauna and her, drawing them in close against his chest. His hug was comforting and protective, and he held the three of them for a moment of refuge and security. Shauna released her hold on JoBeth's hands, nestling her head against Alan's chest, seeking shelter from the world around them. They made their way out of the cemetery, huddled together, united in grief, providing the strength that would only be found in each other. Shauna didn't sleep anymore. Every night she lay in bed, wide-eyed, paralyzed with fear. Her mind replayed the horror of that morning. She heard the gentle creaking of the ceiling beams under the strain of Tamara's lifeless body swaying back and forth in a steady but slow motion. Her neck swollen, her eyes bulging, and the blood dripping, drop by drop, splattering red like a broken egg, dousing the wooden floor beneath her graying toes. The nightmares plagued her. Tamara had left them all scarred beyond repair. "It'll be all right." Alan stood behind her, clutching her shoulders. JoBeth nodded in response. "It'll be okay." She paused, bending her head, thinking of how everything was tainted now, stained like the floor that forever would hold Tamara's blood. No amount of scrubbing could remove the darkness left there. That is what Tamara did. She stained them, darkened their lives, their home, everything. "As long as I have you and our girls, I will be okay." She left a note. Alan's voice coming from behind her seemed disconnected, as if he was speaking to the empty room and not her. JoBeth shook her head emphatically, expelling an exasperated sigh. Of course she did. She tried to pull away, but Alan's arms wrapped around her, holding her firm, her back pressed against him. She breathed heavily, causing his arms to rise up and down with the movement of her chest. He refused to let her go, and she was grateful for it. She didn't know how much more she could handle, the shadow hovering over them, a shadow she'd forgotten used to be with them always. I'm too mad at her to even think about it. What she did to Shauna, to the baby, to us. Her voice trailed off in despair. Alan bent, kissing the soft nape of her neck. "When you're ready, you can read it." "I don't know if that will ever happen. She left Joy mother and fatherless. She left Shauna haunted." JoBeth shook her head, frustrated. "I am angry, Alan. Very angry." "I understand." And he did. He just didn't know how to make things better. JoBeth looked across the table at Alan, silently devouring his plate of roast chicken. It had been days since they spoke of the letter. Her gaze drifted to Shauna. The little girl had not spoken since the funeral. Longer, really, if she thought about it. More like she hadn't spoken since the day she innocently walked into Tamara's lifeless, hanging body. Shauna had barely touched her own plate of food, her eyes fixed and distant as she stared at it. Reaching across the table, JoBeth grabbed her hand, hopeful for a response from the catatonic child. Her small fingers were cold and still, as JoBeth gently squeezed them, yet the girl remained unresponsive. "Okay, I will read the letter." JoBeth's eyes did not waver from Shauna's pale face. Both Alan and the child looked up together and gaped at JoBeth unexpectedly. Alan quickly pushed back his chair and stood up, absent-mindedly dropping his napkin onto the table after wiping his mouth. He left the room and returned quickly, holding a piece of paper with childish handwriting on it. Unfolding it, he cleared his throat. "Do you want me to read it to you?" Standing tall and straight, the letter held taut in his hands. He stared directly at JoBeth. Shauna's hand silently crept into JoBeth's. She felt the soft squeeze of the little knobby digits. "I think we both need you to read it to us," JoBeth said reassuringly, squeezing Shauna's hand back. Nodding, he cleared his throat. "Dear JoBeth and Alan," he began. "I know you ain't gonna understand my doing of this. You ain't the same people as me. I just tired of this world. I don't want to be here no more. I ain't the motherin' type, and I don't want to be no one's ma. You folks will be good for the kid. Give her a home I never knew. She will have a chance in this life if you are her kin. She will be a whore if I raise her. It's true. My ma was one, and I done my share of hustling, but I ain't claimin' to be no saint. I'm mighty grateful for ya all taking me in and calling me kin. I know it cost you lots. Don't tell the kid about me. Let her think you were always her folks. Give her a good name. I kinda like Joy. Tamara." Alan's hands shook as he refolded the letter and placed it back on the table. The room was saturated with palpable tension, and JoBeth could sense Shauna's distress before her body began to tremble. Her hands balled into fists, and she began to weep, her slumped shoulders shaking with each sob. Tears began streaming down her face, the first sign of emotion since the incident happened. The two quickly moved to Shauna, cradling her in their arms and whispering soothing words into her ear. As Shauna's sobs subsided, JoBeth lifted her gaze to meet Alan's. His eyes were red-rimmed and his face unshaven, but his warmth still radiated against JoBeth's hand as she cupped his cheek. Her fingertips tingled as her heart filled with emotion. "We can't stay here." Her voice trembled barely above a whisper. "No," he choked, holding her palm to his mouth. He breathed heavily into the moist flesh, then bent down and gently kissed the top of Shauna's head. Shauna turned her hollow, tear-streaked face up to his, her lips quivering. "I just want to go away from that room," she wept. "I keep seeing her there in that room, swaying with every creak." "Shh," Alan soothed, stroking her long, soft hair. "Everything is going to be all right." "Promise?" Shauna sniffled, rubbing her swollen blue eyes. They were so light, they seemed almost transparent in color. Only a hint of sky blue circled her pupils. "Yes, I promise. Nothing bad is going to happen to my three girls again," Alan said with determination. He meant it. He would rather die than see the women in his life hurt anymore. They had all been hurt too much already in their short lives. Even Tamara's little baby. She had already experienced the loss of both her parents. It was odd, but Alan felt more like he was the baby's father than Oliver. JoBeth was definitely more of a mother than Tamara. His heart thumped, thinking of the baby as his and JoBeth's. It felt so right. So very right. We have to sell the house. We can't raise the baby here. Everyone knows about Tamara, JoBeth said. She would never have a normal life here. Everyone would know. Alan's gaze was fixed on Shauna. His hand gently stroked her soft white blonde hair. He swallowed hard, feeling the ridges of the child's skull beneath his fingers. She was so fragile, defenseless against the world. Thinking of the children, JoBeth, and the life they built together, he pursed his lips, turning to JoBeth. The greens of his feline eyes pierced her with resolution. We will. It took a while before the house was sold. JoBeth and Alan tried to bring things back to normal in their home for the children's sake. However, their once cozy home that had brought them so much joy and security was now cold and unfamiliar. They could not wait to leave it and its ghosts behind. All three agreed to name the baby Mara Joy. Mara, after her birth mother. They all felt that since the baby would never know Tamara, or the person she was, the child should have at least a piece of the name of the woman who had given her life. When they were finally on their way again, in another small covered wagon, JoBeth wondered, as Shauna sat between her and Alan, where their lives would lead them now. Mara Joy cooed, sitting in her arms, and JoBeth gave her a gentle, loving squeeze. Alan looked at Mara Joy and smiled as he ruffled Shauna's hair. She playfully pushed his hand away and laughed a little. That was a good sign. Shauna had not laughed in ages. With time, she would heal. JoBeth was sure of it. They all would be fine, as long as they had each other. They traveled for hours. The dusty dirt road slowly unwound, stretching out in a seemingly endless ribbon of brown. The sun lazily began sinking lower in the sky until Alan pulled up to a narrow path leading to a small, whitewashed church tucked away in a cluster of trees and bushes. JoBeth emerged from her thoughts and glanced up at him, her brows furrowed in confusion. "Alan?" she asked, completely confused. She looked around. All she could see was green emptiness. She could make out no buildings except the church in front of them. There were barely any trees, just a few skinny poplars with some meager leaves clinging to them. Alan stepped down from the wagon and bent down on one knee. Shauna covered her mouth, trying to stifle a little giggle. JoBeth suddenly felt awkward and silly. She looked around to see why Alan was kneeling before her. Trembling, Alan lifted his arms up to her, his eyes wavering with emotion. JoBeth gazed at him, her hands clasped tightly around the plump baby. "I know I'm not perfect, and you could do better than me," he stammered, unsure of what she would say. He had been planning this since he sold the house. He knew they would pass through this church and had made all the arrangements days before. "But, oh hell," he flustered, jumping up and running his fingers through his hair. He turned his back away from JoBeth. This was his last chance. He could no longer put it off. He spun around and seized JoBeth's hand, causing her to let out a surprised yelp. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his eyes filled with love and tears. JoBeth sat silently, her mouth open. "We could be good parents," he continued, not daring to stop. "Ask Shauna. She knows better than anyone." A muffled giggle escaped from behind the child's cupped hands. "Do you have anything to do with this?" JoBeth asked, unable to say anything else. She was totally taken off guard. Never had she expected Alan to propose marriage to her. Shauna shrugged and started to chuckle. The black smudge under her eyes faded for a moment, and light seemed to shine from her blue-gray orbs. "Will you, JoBeth? You know I love you," Alan begged, still holding her hand tightly. He clasped it to his lips and held his breath, afraid to move. JoBeth continued to stare at Shauna's large eyes. "I would be a fool if I said no," she smiled, feeling in her heart she was right. "We will be one big, happy family," Shauna said, smiling faintly. "The mama and papa and the 2 sisters." "Do you want Alan and me to be your mama and papa?" she asked, watching tears well up in Shauna's dazzling clear eyes. "You already are my mama and papa," she said earnestly. JoBeth kissed Shauna's warm forehead, feeling her heart break for the love of the child. She turned to Alan, her hand still firmly in his, her eyes crinkled with emotion. Leaning forward towards him, the baby in her arm shifted lightly. She adjusted her, trying not to squish her. "I love you, too." He squeezed her hand in his, looking into her eyes with such love and devotion that she was overwhelmed. A warmth flooded her, and she knew it would be an honor and a privilege to marry the remarkable man who stood before her. He was all and more she ever needed. Mara Joy threw her head back, nearly headbutting JoBeth in the mouth while squealing in annoyance. "Pass her to me." Shauna reached for the baby. The infant whined in protest, angered over losing JoBeth's attention. "Hush now, Mara Joy. Your mama has business with your papa right now," Shauna soothed, rocking the baby. She wiggled in Shauna's arms for a moment, then stopped as Shauna continued to rock back and forth. JoBeth leapt from the wagon and into Alan's arms, a giddy laugh spilling from her lips. "What are we doing here?" she asked, her excitement uncontainable. Alan's hands reached to frame her face as he smiled at her. "Marry me, here, now," he said, his voice firm but soft. He withdrew a small gold band from his pocket and held it in his palm, his eyes never leaving hers. JoBeth's heart fluttered as she took the ring, holding it up to the light. It sparkled invitingly in the sun before she slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Yes," she whispered as tears of joy streamed down her face. "Yes, I will marry you now." No sooner were the words out of her mouth than Alan jumped up and swung JoBeth around in his arms. "You have made me the happiest man alive." He beamed with joy, his white teeth contrasting sharply with his tanned skin. JoBeth melted into his embrace, her heart filled with a warmth she had never known. He twirled her around, her feet lifted off the ground, and her dress billowed around her ankles. The world seemed to float away, disappearing in a swirl of greens and blues. She felt like she was in a dream, too overwhelmed to believe what was happening. She was going to be Alan's wife. The old reverend stood before them, his milky blue eyes and fly-away white hair illuminated by the setting sun. He lifted his Bible and began to speak. His raspy voice declared them man and wife. Shauna stood holding Mara Joy in her arms beside them, trying hard to suppress a giggle as Alan cupped JoBeth's face in his hands and kissed her softly. JoBeth's eyes closed in bliss as she felt the electric current of his kiss wash over her, and a wave of joy spread across them. The ceremony was over. They were married. The 2 horses continued pulling the buggy along the dirt road, kicking up dust clouds in their wake. After several hours, Alan eventually brought the carriage to a stop. JoBeth nervously tucked Shauna into a tiny bed in the back of the wagon. Exhaustion from months without sleep spread across the little girl's face. Shauna closed her eyes quickly, sleeping deeply for the first time since Tamara's suicide. JoBeth moved Mara Joy's cradle and peered in at her daughter, sucking her fingers contentedly, sleeping peacefully. Her daughter. She gently touched the soft dark curls, damp with sleep, curls so much like her son's hair. She pulled the blanket up around the baby's neck. She was her child now. "Everything good?" Alan whispered from the back of the wagon. JoBeth jumped, her hand fluttering to her heart. "I didn't see you." She shyly faced him, her heart beginning to race. Alan stood in the moonlight, his silhouette seeming to glow. She took a deep breath, watching him as he held open the wagon flap. His broad shoulders and muscular arms were striking against the backdrop of the star-filled night sky. Love swelled in her chest as her stomach churned with a mix of fear and desire. Alan crossed the room, his footsteps echoing across the wooden planks. He sat on the bed that was now his and JoBeth's and gazed at her. He was overcome by emotion as she stood, her eyes slowly focusing on him. He could feel the heat of their connection as he settled into the mattress. His arousal was growing. He shifted his position to cross one leg over the other to hide it from her. He wanted to approach this relationship with caution, as she had been through enough already. Any decision between them would be made with patience, for they had an eternity of love in front of them. He gently touched her arm. His fingertips were electrical, yet comforting against her skin. His voice was soft, like a low hum. "I'm sorry. You seem to be lost in deep thought. What were you thinking?" JoBeth shifted her weight, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, avoiding eye contact with him. Her fingers flew to her mouth, and she nervously bit her nails. Alan stood up and moved closer, his arms softly encircling her shoulders. She was trembling as he pulled her close. "JoBeth." "We're married, Alan." She trembled, his touch raising goosebumps all over her body. She could not face him, fearing that her legs would give out from under her. Taking a deep breath, she exhaled. She felt her body jerk uncontrollably with anxiety, betraying her. She tried in vain to relax. "I am not Father James. I will never hurt you." His fingers caressed her arm, causing a shiver to run up her spine. "We have our whole lives to be together. I will wait till you are ready." She turned to face him. He stood so close to her, she could feel his breath on her body and the response it made. Her eyes rimmed with tears. She whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Feeling the shaking in her body subside, he reached out, his calloused fingers brushing her cheek with tenderness, and gently kissed her forehead. Breaking their gaze, he stepped back, turning to the makeshift bed that had been his home since they had begun their journey. "Alan, I love you. I want to be with you as your wife. I do. I'm just scared." "I love you too." He stood again and kissed her cheek. "Don't worry. Everything will be fine." JoBeth nestled into the nook of the bed across from Alan, who sighed, turning on his side, facing away from JoBeth. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out his desire for her. She was his bride. He yearned to embrace her, but he would wait until she was truly ready to become his wife. He would wait forever if that was what she wanted. With that thought, he finally drifted off to sleep. JoBeth could not sleep. The sounds in the wagon told her everyone else could. Quietly, she got up and stepped outside to clear her mind. The cool, fresh air on her face, her nostrils filled with the smells around her. She liked the fragrance of grass swaying in the wind, mingled with the scent of horses. It was liberating. She sensed someone behind her shoulder and she wheeled around, alert. Alan stood before her, his toned, broad chest and shoulders illuminated by the light of the moon. His gaze locked hers, his desire reflected in the slow burning of longing across his face. She stepped forward, wanting to be close to him, and he pulled her tightly against his body. She melted against him, sinking into the solidness of his chest, feeling his heart beating against hers. His scent was a heady mix of musk and salt. She inhaled deeply, pressing her lips to the nape of his neck, His skin was warm as she kissed him, hungrily, savoring his unique smell. "JoBeth," he moaned, rubbing her back. She gently took his hand and moved it along her side. Shivers of fear and joy coursed through her body. Alan sighed deeply, slipping his fingers into the fold of JoBeth's nightgown. She arched her back as he released her breasts. His warm hands encircled each soft mound. Delicately, he bent his head, brushing his lips against an erect nipple. Electrical current bolted through JoBeth's body as Alan began to suckle one nipple and the other. As he moved his lips, his mouth became more and more hungry for her flesh, needing to consume her. "Are you sure?" he asked, looking into her flushed face. "Yes." She tangled her fingers into his rusty hair, pulling him to her waiting body. "I love you so much." He bent back down to her heaving bosom, feeling the texture of her with his tongue. JoBeth arched her back again, a moan escaping from her lips. Alan began to trace his hands down her tight belly. He lifted his head and kissed her hard on the mouth. She greedily accepted his tongue. He peeled back her nightgown, letting it drop to the ground. Moonlight glistened on her skin as his hand traced her exposed shoulders and angular collarbone. Placing a hand between her legs, he felt her warmth. She stiffened briefly as Alan gently laid her on the soft grass and began kissing her face, eyes, and mouth, moving towards the soft ridges of her collarbone and breasts. JoBeth groaned with pleasure. She gasped as his lips began to kiss her belly, moving lower and lower. Her legs fanned out as his lips explored. Her control was lost when his head slipped easily between her legs. Never could she imagine it could be like this. With pleasure, she began to squirm beneath him, her fingers raking the grass beside her. She felt her body wanting to rise, arching towards the full moon, staring down brightly at them. He sat up and removed his trousers, exposing his erection. It no longer scared JoBeth. She reached out and stroked him, wanting him to fill her with a need she had never known. He pressed his broad chest against her, easing her back flat again on the ground. His hands held her face as his lips brushed against hers, gentle yet passionate. She felt a wave of heat wash over her as he swept aside her hair, tasting every inch of her skin as he explored her. His lips trailed down her neck and across her face, leaving a trail of burning kisses. JoBeth wrapped her long, lean legs around his body, surprised at how natural it felt. Alan leaned forward, looked deeply into JoBeth's eyes, and entered her with ease. She cried out his name as he slipped inside her, her body pulsing around him. There was no Alan, no JoBeth. They were no longer two, but one, like pieces of a lost puzzle put back together. Alan sobbed as his longing for JoBeth overtook him. They wrapped themselves in each other, their bodies mingling in unity, crying together as they reached climax and collapsed. Still attached, their chests heaving, and the smell of their lovemaking thick in the air. They drifted off into a deep sleep, only to reawaken an hour later, as if pulled together by an invisible thread. The passion of their embrace burned hotter than before as they held each other, close, moving in complete harmony. Time seemed to stand still. They finally separated when the faintest rays of sunlight appeared and the birds began to chirp their morning song. The children were about to wake up. Reluctantly, they dressed, kissed each other one more time, and headed back to the wagon. Mara Joy stirred. A new day had begun.